At the divorce hearing, my husband hired the most expensive sharks to leave me penniless. "You are finished," he laughed. I looked helpless, but I had made one call. Suddenly, the doors burst open. The most feared attorney in the state walked in, the son of my late maid whose tuition I secretly paid. The judge froze. 20 minutes later, everything changed. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. My name is Sheila, and at 63 years old, I thought I had seen the worst of human nature. I was wrong. The courthouse on Main Street felt colder than usual that Tuesday morning in March. The marble floors echoed with every step, and the smell of old wood and floor wax hung heavy in the air. I sat on the hard oak bench outside courtroom B, my hands folded in my lap, watching the second hand of the wall clock tick away the final moments of my 41-year marriage. Tobias sat across from me with his team of lawyers, 3 of them. Each one cost $500 an hour, he had made sure to tell me. They wore identical charcoal suits and carried briefcases that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 6 months. My own attorney, Mr. Peterson, was a kind man in his 70s who charged me $200 an hour and looked nervous every time he glanced at Tobias's legal army. "You ready for this, sweetheart?" Tobias called out, his voice dripping with false concern. The pet name he had used for decades now sounded like mockery. "I hope you understand this is just business." I didn't respond. What was there to say? For the past 8 months, since he had served me with divorce papers, Tobias had made it clear that he intended to leave me with nothing. The house we had lived in for 35 years, the business he had built while I supported him, even the small savings account I thought was ours together. He wanted it all. "Mrs. Henderson?" The bailiff appeared at my side. "Judge Morrison is ready for you." I stood on shaking legs and smoothed my navy blue dress. It was the same dress I had worn to Carmen's funeral 3 years ago. Carmen, my housekeeper who had become so much more than that. She had been the only person who truly knew the woman I was beneath the surface that Tobias saw every day. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected. High windows let in streams of pale sunlight that seemed too cheerful for what was about to happen. Judge Morrison, a stern woman in her 50s, sat behind the bench shuffling through papers. Tobias and his lawyers took up the entire left side of the room, while Mr. Peterson and I looked tiny and outnumbered on the right. "This is a dissolution of marriage proceeding," Judge Morrison began, her voice echoing in the nearly empty room. "Mr. Caldwell, you may present your case." Tobias's lead attorney, a sharp-faced man named Caldwell, stood up with theatrical precision. "Your Honor, my client Tobias Henderson seeks a fair division of marital assets. However, we must note that Mrs. Henderson contributed very little to the accumulation of these assets during their marriage." The words hit me like a physical blow. Very little. After 4 decades of keeping his house, raising the children who had moved far away, supporting his career while putting my own dreams aside. Very little. "Mrs. Henderson," Caldwell continued, consulting his notes, "was primarily a homemaker throughout the marriage. She holds no professional credentials, contributed no significant income, and has no documented financial contributions to the marital estate valued at approximately $850,000. $850,000. That was what our life together was worth, apparently. The house on Elm Street where I had cooked thousands of meals, the business Tobias started in our garage while I worked a part-time job to pay our bills, the savings we had built together, penny by penny. Therefore, Caldwell's voice grew stronger, we request that Mrs. Henderson receive only the minimum required by law, as she lacks the skills or means to contribute meaningfully to her own support. I felt Mr. Peterson shift beside me, his pen scratching frantically across his legal pad. He was a good man, but I could see the defeat in his shoulders. We both knew he was outmatched. Judge Morrison looked at me with something that might have been pity. "Mrs. Henderson, do you wish to respond?" Mr. Peterson started to stand, but I placed a gentle hand on his arm. "Your Honor," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I would like to make a brief phone call before we proceed. It's important." The judge frowned. "Mrs. Henderson, this is highly irregular." "I understand, Your Honor, but there's someone who needs to know what's happening here today." Tobias let out a bark of laughter. "Who are you going to call, Sheila? Your book club? Your knitting circle?" His lawyers chuckled appreciatively at his joke. "Your Honor, my wife has always been dramatic. She's probably going to call one of her friends to come hold her hand." The humiliation burned in my chest, but I kept my voice calm. "May I make the call, Your Honor? It will only take a moment." Judge Morrison checked her watch. 5 minutes, Mrs. Henderson. Then we continue." I walked to the back of the courtroom, my heels clicking on the marble floor. My phone felt heavy in my hand as I scrolled through my contacts. When I found the number I was looking for, my finger hesitated over the screen for just a moment. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Wesley Morrison Law Group." "Wesley," I said quietly. "It's Sheila. I need you." There was a pause, then his voice changed completely. "Aunt Sheila? What's wrong? Are you okay?" He had called me Aunt Sheila since he was 7 years old, even though we shared no blood. "I'm at the courthouse downtown, courtroom B, the divorce hearing. He's trying to take everything." Another pause, longer this time. When Wesley spoke again, his voice was cold steel. "I'll be right there." I hung up and walked back to my seat. Tobias was still grinning, whispering something to his lawyers that made them all laugh. Mr. Peterson looked at me with concern. "Who did you call?" he whispered. "A friend," I said simply. Judge Morrison resumed the proceedings. "Mr. Peterson, your response to Mr. Caldwell's arguments?" Mr. Peterson stood, his hands trembling slightly. "Your Honor, Mrs. Henderson has been a devoted wife and mother for over 4 decades. While her contributions may not show up on a balance sheet, they were invaluable to the success of this marriage and Mr. Henderson's business." Tobias rolled his eyes dramatically. Caldwell stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. Emotional arguments don't change the financial facts, Mrs. Henderson simply doesn't have the education, experience, or capability to manage significant assets. She would be better served with a modest settlement that reflects her limited contribution to the marriage." Limited contribution. The words echoed in my head as I thought about all the nights I had stayed up with sick children while Tobias traveled for business. All the times I had entertained his clients, planned his parties, supported his dreams while mine gathered dust. "Furthermore," Caldwell continued, "Mrs. Henderson has shown poor financial judgment throughout the marriage. She has no understanding of investments, business operations, or financial planning. Granting her a significant portion of the marital assets would be irresponsible." Tobias leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. He caught my eye and smiled. Not the warm smile I had fallen in love with 43 years ago, but something cold and triumphant. "You know what, Sheila?" he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You should be grateful for whatever you get. You've never been anything but a housewife. You don't know how to take care of yourself, let alone money. You are nobody." The words hung in the air like a slap. Judge Morrison frowned at the outburst, but Tobias didn't care. He was enjoying this. "You are nobody," he repeated, his voice softer, but somehow more cutting. "You always have been. I don't know why I stayed married to you as long as I did." Something broke inside me then. Not my spirit, that had been broken and mended so many times over the years, but something else. The last thread of whatever had once connected us. The final remnant of the girl who had believed that love conquered all. I looked at him sitting there with his expensive lawyers, so confident in his cruelty. He had no idea what was coming. He had no idea who I really was or what I had been doing all these years while he dismissed me as nobody. The courtroom doors were heavy oak, and when they opened, They made a sound like thunder. Every head turned toward the back of the room. Even Judge Morrison looked up from her papers. And that's when everything changed. My phone buzzed with a text message. I glanced down and smiled for the first time in months. I'm here. W. Tobias was still laughing with his lawyers, completely unaware that his world was about to collapse around him. He thought he knew everything about me, thought he had accounted for every possibility. But there were some things Tobias had never known about his wife of 41 years. Some secrets I had kept so well that they had become invisible, even to me sometimes. The doors opened wider, and I could hear footsteps in the hallway. Confident footsteps that belonged to someone who had never been told he was nobody. Someone I had made sure of that. The footsteps in the hallway grew closer, but my mind drifted back to a different time, a different courtroom. The small family court where I had first met Carmen Morales 28 years ago. It was 1995, and I was 35 years old, desperate for help with the house and the children while Tobias traveled constantly for his growing business. Carmen was 23, a young mother herself, holding the hand of her 5-year-old son Wesley as she waited to translate for her elderly neighbor in a landlord dispute. I remember thinking how dignified she looked despite her obvious nervousness. Her black hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple blue dress that was carefully mended at the hem. Wesley stood quietly beside her, his dark eyes taking in everything around him with the kind of intelligence that you notice immediately. "Excuse me," I had said, approaching her during a break in the proceedings. "I couldn't help but notice how well you handle yourself. Are you looking for work?" Carmen's English was hesitant then, but her eyes lit up with hope. "Si, yes. I clean houses. I cook. I take very good care." That was how it started. Carmen came to work for us 3 days a week, bringing Wesley with her during school holidays and sick days. Tobias barely noticed them. To him, they were just part of the household machinery that kept his life running smoothly while he focused on what he considered important. But I noticed everything. I noticed how Carmen would quietly fix things around the house that Tobias never even saw were broken. I noticed how she always made sure there were fresh flowers on the dining room table. Not because I asked her to, but because she understood that small, beautiful things mattered. Most of all, I noticed Wesley. Even at 5 years old, Wesley was special. While other children his age played with toys, he would sit at our kitchen table carefully copying letters from my recipe cards, teaching himself to read in English. When Carmen worked late, I would help him with his homework, watching as his face lit up when he understood something new. "He is very smart," Carmen would say with pride, but also with worry. "Too smart for our neighborhood. I want better for him, but—" She never finished those sentences, but I understood. Carmen cleaned houses and worked in a factory on weekends. Wesley's father had disappeared before he was born. There was no money for the kind of education that could unlock Wesley's potential. That's when I started to plan. It began small. I would buy extra school supplies and casually mention that Wesley could use them for his projects. I enrolled him in the library's summer reading program and drove him there myself when Carmen was working. When he needed a new backpack for school, I bought 2, one for him and one for my own son, saying I had gotten a discount for buying in bulk. Tobias never noticed the extra expenses. Why would he? He was making good money by then, and I had always been careful with the household budget. A few dollars here and there for school supplies, library fines, or occasional treats for Wesley were invisible in our larger financial picture. But as Wesley got older, my planning became more deliberate. I opened a separate savings account using my maiden name, depositing $20 or $30 a week from the grocery money. Over the years, it added up. By the time Wesley was in middle school, I had saved nearly $15,000. That's when Carmen got sick. It started with fatigue that she blamed on working too hard. Then came the headaches, the unexplained weight loss, the bruises that wouldn't heal. By the time she finally went to a doctor, the cancer had already spread. I drove her to every appointment, sitting in sterile waiting rooms while she underwent test after test. Tobias never asked where I went on those afternoons. As long as dinner was on the table when he got home, he didn't care how I spent my days. "I'm scared for Wesley," Carmen told me during one of our long waits at the oncology center. "If something happens to me, he has no one. My family in Mexico, they can't take him. And he's so close to graduating high school." I took her hand, feeling how thin it had become. "Nothing's going to happen to you. And even if it did, Wesley will be fine. I promise you that." It was a promise I intended to keep. The treatments were brutal and expensive. Carmen's insurance covered some of it, but not nearly enough. I quietly paid the bills that insurance wouldn't cover, using money from my secret account and telling Carmen it was charity from the church. She was too proud to accept direct help, but she couldn't argue with what she thought was community assistance. Meanwhile, Wesley was thriving in high school. His grades were perfect, his teachers raved about his potential, and he had been accepted to several colleges. But college meant money. Lots of money that Carmen didn't have and couldn't borrow. That's when I made the biggest decision of my life. I had been planning to use my secret savings to finally take the art classes I had dreamed of since I was young. For 40 years, I had put my own ambitions aside for Tobias's career, for the children's needs, for everyone else's priorities. The money I had saved was going to be my chance to finally do something just for me. Instead, I used it to secure Wesley's future. I arranged for a scholarship through a fictional foundation I created, complete with official-looking paperwork that I typed up on Tobias's business computer. To Wesley and Carmen, it appeared that an anonymous benefactor had noticed his academic excellence and wanted to invest in his education. $1,200 a month, I told them, watching Wesley's face light up with hope. Enough to cover tuition, books, and living expenses at the state university. Carmen cried when I showed her the paperwork. Wesley hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. They both thought it was a miracle. It wasn't a miracle. It was sacrifice. It was 40 years of grocery money saved $1 at a time. It was the art classes I would never take, the small luxuries I would never buy for myself, the dreams I set aside one more time. But seeing Wesley graduate valedictorian of his high school class, watching him walk across that stage with tears of joy in his eyes, knowing that he would have a chance to become everything he was meant to be, that was worth more than any art class could ever be. Carmen lived to see him start college, but she didn't live to see him graduate. The cancer took her 2 years into Wesley's studies on a cold December morning while I held her hand in the hospital room. "Take care of him," she whispered with her last breath. "He loves you like a mother." I promised her I would, and I kept that promise the same way I kept all my promises, quietly, completely, and without expecting anything in return. Wesley threw himself into his studies after his mother died. He changed his major to law, driven by a fierce determination to fight for people like Carmen, people who couldn't fight for themselves. I continued to send the monthly scholarship checks, and he continued to believe they came from some anonymous foundation. During his law school years, I would get calls from him late at night when he was stressed about exams or worried about his future. He never called me Sheila during those conversations, always Aunt Sheila, the honorary title he had given me when he was 7 years old. "I'm going to make you proud," he would say. "I'm going to make Mom proud. I'm going to be somebody important so I can help other people the way you both helped me." "You already make us proud," I would tell him. "You always have." By the time Wesley passed the bar exam and started his own law practice, I had spent nearly $45,000 on his education. Tobias never noticed. Why would he? He was too busy building his own empire to pay attention to his wife's small, careful acts of rebellion. Wesley's law practice grew quickly. He had a reputation for taking cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch, for fighting harder than anyone expected, for never backing down when he believed in something. Within 5 years, he was one of the most respected attorneys in the state, and through it all, he still called me Aunt Sheila. 3 years ago, when Carmen had been gone for 8 months and Wesley was establishing his reputation as a formidable lawyer, Tobias started talking about divorce for the first time. It was casual at first. Jokes about how much easier his life would be without a wife to worry about. Comments about how young and free he felt when he traveled for business. That's when I started keeping records. I documented every cruel comment, every dismissive gesture, every time he made me feel small and invisible. I took photos of the bruises on my arms from the times he grabbed me too hard when he was angry. I saved emails where he talked to his business partners about me like I was furniture that he was tired of looking at. I did it quietly, the same way I had done everything else in my life. And I saved it all in a folder that I kept hidden behind my recipe cards in the kitchen. The same place where Wesley used to practice his letters all those years ago. Carmen had taught me that love wasn't just about sacrifice. It was about strategy. It was about planting seeds for the future, even when you couldn't see how they would grow. Now, sitting in that courtroom listening to my husband call me nobody, I could hear those seeds beginning to bloom. The footsteps in the hallway had stopped. Someone was standing just outside the courtroom doors. Tobias was still laughing with his lawyers, still so confident in his victory. He had no idea that the scared 5-year-old boy who used to sit at our kitchen table had grown up to become the one person in this state that nobody wanted to face in court. He had no idea that every dollar he thought I had wasted on groceries and household expenses had actually been an investment in this exact moment. Most of all, he had no idea that love, real love, the kind that expects nothing in return, always finds a way to protect what matters most. The doors were about to open, and everything he thought he knew about his nobody wife was about to change forever. The heavy oak doors of Courtroom B swung open with a force that made everyone turn. The sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot, cutting through Tobias's laughter and the whispered conversations of his legal team. Wesley Morrison stepped into the courtroom, and everything changed. He was 38 years old now, tall and imposing in a charcoal gray suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and he carried himself with the kind of quiet confidence that comes from never losing a case that mattered. But what struck me most was his eyes. They were the same intelligent eyes I had seen in that 5-year-old boy who used to practice his letters at my kitchen table, but now they held something else: power, authority. The absolute certainty of someone who had never been called nobody and never would be. Behind him walked 2 associates, a young man and woman who moved with the precise efficiency of a well-oiled machine. Each carried expensive leather briefcases and tablet computers, ready for whatever legal battle lay ahead. Judge Morrison looked up from her papers, clearly surprised by the dramatic entrance. "Excuse me, but this is a closed proceeding. Are you attorneys involved in this case?" Wesley's voice filled the courtroom when he spoke, rich and commanding. "Yes, Your Honor. Wesley Morrison of Morrison Law Group. I'm here to represent Mrs. Sheila Henderson in this divorce proceeding." The silence that followed was deafening. Mr. Peterson looked at me with complete confusion. Tobias's expression had frozen somewhere between amusement and alarm. His lawyers suddenly looked less confident, their expensive suits seeming a little less impressive in the presence of the man who had just walked into their courtroom. But it was Tobias himself who provided the most satisfying reaction. The color drained from his face as recognition slowly dawned. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, and his hands gripped the edge of the table so tightly that his knuckles went white. "Wesley?" he whispered, the name coming out like a prayer or a curse. "Carmen's boy?" Wesley's eyes found Tobias across the courtroom, and his expression was as cold as winter. "Mr. Henderson, it's been a long time." Judge Morrison looked between them, clearly sensing the tension. "Mr. Morrison, I wasn't aware that Mrs. Henderson had retained new counsel. Mr. Peterson, were you informed of this change in representation?" Poor Mr. Peterson looked as confused as everyone else. "Your Honor, this is the first I'm hearing of it." I stood slowly, feeling stronger than I had in months. "Your Honor, I would like to dismiss Mr. Peterson and retain Mr. Morrison as my attorney. Thank you, Mr. Peterson, for your service. Mr. Peterson gathered his papers with visible relief. He was a good man, but we both knew he had been drowning in this case from the beginning. As he packed up his briefcase, he leaned over and whispered, "Good luck, Sheila. I have a feeling you're going to need it less than I thought." Wesley approached the defendant's table with his associates, setting down their briefcases with practiced efficiency. As he moved closer, I could see Tobias's panic growing. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool air conditioning, and his breathing had become shallow and rapid. "Your Honor," Caldwell, Tobias's lead attorney, stood up with less confidence than he had shown all morning. "We object to this last-minute substitution. This appears to be a deliberate attempt to disrupt these proceedings." Wesley turned toward Caldwell with a smile that could have frozen hell. "Mr. Caldwell, isn't it? I'm familiar with your work. Mostly divorce cases where you try to intimidate women into accepting inadequate settlements. How's that working out for you lately?" Caldwell's face reddened. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular and inappropriate." Judge Morrison held up her hand for silence. "Mr. Morrison, while your entrance was certainly dramatic, you do have the right to represent Mrs. Henderson if she chooses to retain you. However, I hope you're prepared to proceed immediately. We've already heard opening arguments from Mr. Caldwell." Wesley opened his briefcase with deliberate calm. "Your Honor, I've been following this case since it was filed 8 months ago. I'm fully prepared to proceed." 8 months. He had been watching this entire time, waiting for the right moment. I felt a surge of emotion that I couldn't quite name. Gratitude, amazement, and something that felt like the fierce pride a mother feels for her child. Tobias leaned forward in his chair, his voice hoarse with disbelief. "How is this possible? How can you afford him, Sheila? Wesley Morrison charges $5,000 an hour. You don't have that kind of money." Wesley turned to face Tobias fully, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of 28 years of gratitude and 15 years of professional success. "Mr. Henderson, there are some things money can't buy. There are some debts that can never be repaid with cash. And there are some women who deserve better than being called nobody by the men who should have cherished them." The courtroom fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Tobias stared at Wesley as if he were seeing a ghost, which in a way, he was. The ghost of all the kindnesses he had never noticed, all the sacrifices he had dismissed, all the love he had taken for granted. "You don't understand," Tobias said, his voice rising with desperation. "This woman has been living off my success for 40 years. She's never contributed anything meaningful to our marriage or our finances. She doesn't deserve half of what I've built." Wesley's associate, the young woman, opened her tablet and handed it to him. He glanced at the screen, then looked back at Tobias with an expression of mild curiosity. "That's interesting, Mr. Henderson, because according to the financial records we've obtained, your wife has made some very significant contributions over the years. Contributions you apparently weren't aware of." Caldwell jumped to his feet. "Objection. What financial records? We haven't seen any discovery that supports that claim." Wesley smiled again, and this time there was something predatory in it. "Mr. Caldwell, discovery works both ways. While you were busy trying to prove that Mrs. Henderson contributed nothing to this marriage, we were busy proving exactly the opposite." He nodded to his male associate, who immediately began setting up a laptop and portable projector. Within minutes, they had transformed the courtroom into a presentation space that would have made any corporate boardroom envious. "Your Honor," Wesley continued, "with the court's permission, I'd like to present evidence that will completely reframe how we view Mrs. Henderson's contributions to this marriage." Judge Morrison leaned forward with interest. "Proceed, Mr. Morrison." The first image that appeared on the courtroom wall was a photograph of our house on Elm Street, taken the day we moved in 35 years ago. It looked small and shabby, with peeling paint and a yard full of weeds. "This is the home that Mr. and Mrs. Henderson purchased in 1988, Wesley said, using a laser pointer to highlight different areas of the photograph. Purchase price, $89,000. They put down $18,000 and financed the rest. The next image showed the same house as it looked today. Beautiful landscaping, fresh paint, upgraded windows, and a welcoming front porch that hadn't existed in the original structure. This is the same house today, valued at $350,000. Mr. Henderson's financial statements claim that this increase in value is due to market appreciation and improvements he made personally. Wesley clicked to the next slide, which showed a detailed timeline of home improvements and their costs. However, our investigation reveals that Mrs. Henderson personally managed and often physically performed most of these improvements over the past 3 decades. She researched contractors, negotiated prices, supervised work, and in many cases, did the labor herself to save money. I remembered those years. Weekends spent painting rooms while Tobias played golf, evenings spent researching the best deals on appliances while he watched television, hours spent in the garden creating the beautiful landscaping that now added so much value to our home. Furthermore, Wesley continued, Mrs. Henderson's careful financial management and household budgeting allowed the family to save an additional $2,000 to $3,000 per year that was reinvested in the property and Mr. Henderson's business. Tobias was shaking his head frantically. That's not true. I worked for everything we have. She just spent my money. Wesley turned to face him directly. Mr. Henderson, do you remember the year 1993? When your business was failing and you were 3 months behind on your commercial rent? Tobias's face went pale. That was different. That was just a rough patch. Indeed, a rough patch that would have ended your business if Mrs. Henderson hadn't taken a part-time job at the grocery store and used her earnings to keep your business afloat. 6 months of working nights and weekends, earning $8 an hour, while also maintaining your household and caring for your 2 young children. I had forgotten that Wesley knew about those months. He would have been only 8 years old then, but Carmen had been watching my children during some of those evening shifts. Apparently, he remembered more than I realized. The next slide showed bank records from that period, with deposits from my grocery store job clearly marked. $2,400, Wesley said. That's how much Mrs. Henderson earned during those 6 months. Every penny went to keeping her husband's business alive. Without her intervention, there would be no business for us to divide today. Caldwell was furiously taking notes, but I could see the defeat in his posture. This wasn't the narrative they had prepared for. This wasn't the helpless housewife they thought they were facing. Your Honor, Wesley said, this pattern of contribution and sacrifice continued throughout the 41 years of this marriage. Mrs. Henderson didn't just keep house and raise children. She was the silent partner who made her husband's success possible. The presentation continued with slide after slide of evidence I didn't even know existed. Records of the dinner parties I had planned and hosted for Tobias's business clients. Documentation of the times I had filled in as his secretary when he couldn't afford to hire help. Proof of the networking and relationship building I had done within the wives' circle that had led to some of his biggest contracts. But it was the final slide that took my breath away. It was a photograph of Wesley's college graduation, with me standing beside him in my best dress, both of us smiling at the camera. Below it, in neat columns, was a financial breakdown. Your Honor, Wesley said, his voice softer now but no less powerful. I want the court to understand something about the woman who sits before you today. Mrs. Henderson didn't just contribute to her own family's success. For 15 years, she contributed to mine. The courtroom was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. This woman, Wesley continued, used money she had saved from careful household management to pay for my college education. $1,200 a month for 4 years of undergraduate study, then $1,500 a month for 3 years of law school. She did this quietly, without fanfare, asking for nothing in return except that I study hard and make something of myself. Tobias's mouth fell open. In 41 years of marriage, he had never known about my secret savings account or the scholarship I had created for Wesley. The total amount Mrs. Henderson invested in my education was $45,600. Money that could have been used for her own dreams, her own education, her own future. Instead, she chose to invest in a young man she believed in, creating opportunities that didn't exist before she opened her heart and her wallet. Wesley turned back to face Tobias, and his voice became steel again. So, when you say that Mrs. Henderson has never contributed anything meaningful, Mr. Henderson, I have to disagree. She contributed to raising me. And now I'm here to make sure she gets everything she deserves. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of Tobias's ragged breathing. He looked like a man who had just watched his entire world collapse, because in many ways, he had. Judge Morrison leaned back in her chair, clearly processing everything she had just heard. This is quite compelling, Mr. Morrison. Do you have additional evidence to present? Wesley's smile was sharp as a blade. Your Honor, we're just getting started. Wesley moved to the center of the courtroom like a predator who had finally cornered his prey. The confidence in his movements reminded me of Carmen when she was determined to fix something that others had given up on. There was a quiet certainty that the job would be done right, no matter how long it took. Your Honor, Wesley continued, what we've shown so far represents only Mrs. Henderson's documented financial contributions. But there's another category of evidence that I believe will be even more compelling. He nodded to his female associate, who immediately began distributing manila folders to Judge Morrison, Caldwell, and the court reporter. Over the past 15 years, Mrs. Henderson has been documenting a pattern of emotional and financial abuse that goes far beyond the typical breakdown of a marriage. What she discovered is that Mr. Henderson has been systematically undermining her confidence, isolating her from potential income sources, and creating a financial dependency that he believed would make her too afraid to leave. Tobias shot to his feet, his face flushed with rage. That's a lie. I never abused anyone. Your Honor, this is character assassination. Judge Morrison's voice was sharp with authority. Mr. Henderson, you will remain seated and allow your attorney to speak for you. Another outburst like that and I'll hold you in contempt. Tobias sank back into his chair, but his breathing was rapid and shallow. Caldwell placed a restraining hand on his arm, whispering urgently in his ear. Wesley opened his own copy of the folder, revealing page after page of photographs, printed emails, and handwritten notes. Mrs. Henderson began keeping these records in 2008, initially as a way to document what she thought might be early signs of dementia. She was concerned about her husband's increasing irritability and memory lapses regarding conversations they had shared. I remembered those early days of record-keeping. I had genuinely worried that Tobias might be developing some kind of cognitive issue because the man I was living with seemed so different from the one I had married. It took me years to realize that he hadn't changed. I had simply stopped making excuses for behavior I should never have tolerated. However, Wesley continued, what she documented instead was a deliberate pattern of psychological manipulation designed to make her question her own memory, her own worth, and her own capabilities. The first photograph Wesley displayed was one I had taken with a disposable camera, showing bruises on my upper arm in the shape of fingerprints. This photograph was taken on March 15, 2009, after Mr. Henderson grabbed Mrs. Henderson's arm hard enough to leave marks because she had embarrassed him at a business dinner by expressing an opinion about local politics that differed from his own. Tobias made a strangled sound, but Caldwell kept him in his seat. Mrs. Henderson's notes from that evening indicate that Mr. Henderson told her she had no right to speak about things she didn't understand, and that her role at these events was to look nice and keep quiet. Wesley clicked to the next image, a screenshot of a text message conversation. This exchange from June 2010 shows Mr. Henderson berating Mrs. Henderson for spending $12 on groceries that he deemed unnecessary. despite the fact that his business had earned over $60,000 that month. I could see Judge Morrison reading along, her expression growing more serious with each piece of evidence. The pattern escalates over time, Wesley explained. By 2012, Mr. Henderson was requiring Mrs. Henderson to ask permission for any purchase over $5, while simultaneously criticizing her for not contributing to the household income. Wesley's male associate handed him a thick stack of printed emails. These are emails from Mr. Henderson to his business partners between 2013 and 2018. In them, he regularly refers to his wife as dead weight, describes her as too stupid to understand business, and jokes about how easy it would be to get rid of her if divorce laws weren't so unfavorable to men. Caldwell was frantically scribbling notes, but I could see the defeat in his posture. Everything Wesley was presenting was documented, dated, and devastating. "Your Honor," Caldwell said desperately, "these emails are taken out of context. Men sometimes complain about their spouses to their friends. It doesn't constitute abuse." Wesley turned to face Caldwell with the patience of a professor explaining something to a particularly slow student. "Mr. Caldwell, you're absolutely right. Men do sometimes complain about their spouses. But let me show you what makes this different." The next slide showed a timeline spanning 10 years, with dozens of incidents marked in red. "This isn't occasional venting, Mr. Caldwell. This is a sustained campaign designed to isolate Mrs. Henderson from any source of independence or self-confidence. Every time she expressed interest in taking a class, getting a job, or pursuing a hobby, Mr. Henderson found a way to sabotage it." Wesley clicked through a series of documented incidents. 2011. Mrs. Henderson enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the community college. Mr. Henderson scheduled mandatory business dinners every Tuesday night for 6 weeks until she was forced to drop out. Another click. 2014. Mrs. Henderson was offered a part-time position at the local library. Mr. Henderson convinced her that the 20 hours a week would neglect her household duties and that the $15 an hour pay wasn't worth the embarrassment of his wife working for so little. Click. 2016. Mrs. Henderson joined a book club that met monthly. Mr. R. Henderson complained so consistently about the time it took away from his needs that she stopped attending after 4 months. Each incident seemed small by itself, but seeing them laid out chronologically painted a picture of systematic control that made my stomach turn. I had lived through each of these moments, but I had never seen the pattern until now. The goal, Wesley explained, was to ensure that Mrs. Henderson remained financially and emotionally dependent on Mr. Henderson, making it impossible for her to leave even if she wanted to. Judge Morrison looked up from the documents. "Mr. Morrison, this is certainly disturbing, but how does it relate to the financial aspects of this divorce?" Wesley smiled. "I'm glad you asked, Your Honor, because Mr. Henderson's behavior wasn't just cruel, it was also illegal." The next slide showed bank records that I had never seen before. Multiple accounts, all in Tobias's name only, with balances that made my head spin. While Mr. Henderson was telling his wife that they needed to be careful with money and limiting her access to household funds, he was secretly transferring marital assets into accounts that she didn't know existed. Caldwell stood up quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. We haven't seen these records before. How did opposing counsel obtain confidential banking information?" Wesley's expression was innocent. "Mr. Caldwell, these records were subpoenaed from the banks after we discovered their existence through Mr. Henderson's own emails. It turns out that when you joke about hiding money from your wife in writing, it creates what we in the legal profession call evidence." The blood drained from Tobias's face as Wesley continued. "Over the past 8 years, Mr. Henderson has moved approximately $230,000 in marital funds into personal accounts. Money that should have been available for household expenses, Mrs. Henderson's personal use, and joint financial planning. $230,000. I felt dizzy trying to comprehend the amount. All those years of worrying about grocery budgets and asking permission for small purchases, while Tobias was hiding a fortune that rightfully belonged to both of us. Furthermore, Wesley said, his voice gaining momentum, Mr. Henderson used this hidden money to finance a lifestyle that Mrs. Henderson wasn't allowed to share. Business trips that were actually vacations, expensive restaurants where he entertained clients alone, even a luxury car that he claimed was necessary for business, but kept registered to his company rather than bringing it home. Wesley's associates had prepared a detailed financial analysis that they projected onto the courtroom wall. Every hidden account, every secret transaction, every dollar that Tobias had diverted from our marriage was laid out in neat columns and graphs. The total value of assets that Mr. Henderson attempted to hide from this divorce proceeding is $473,000, Wesley announced. Combined with the openly acknowledged marital assets of $850,000, we're looking at a marital estate worth over $1.3 million. $1.3 million. I had been living like a pauper while married to a secret millionaire. Tobias was hyperventilating now, his expensive lawyers looking helpless as their carefully constructed case collapsed around them. Caldwell was flipping through papers desperately, searching for some argument that could salvage the situation. "Your Honor," Caldwell said, his voice tight with desperation, "even if these allegations are true, it doesn't change the fact that Mrs. Henderson lacks the experience to manage significant financial assets. The responsible course of action would be to award her a modest settlement that ensures her security without overwhelming her limited capabilities." The condescension in his voice made my teeth clench, but Wesley just smiled wider. "That's an interesting argument, Mr. Caldwell. Let me address the question of Mrs. Henderson's financial capabilities." Wesley nodded to his female associate, who handed him another folder. Mrs. Henderson has been managing a complex financial portfolio for the past 15 years without her husband's knowledge or assistance. She opened and maintained separate investment accounts, researched and selected mutual funds, and achieved an average annual return of 7.4% on her investments. The next slide showed the growth of my secret education fund for Wesley, from the initial small deposits to the final account balance when I closed it after his graduation. This represents sophisticated financial planning and investment management that many professional advisors would be proud of. Mrs. Henderson turned household savings of $35,000 into the $45,600 that funded a complete college and law school education. Wesley turned to face Caldwell directly. "So when you suggest that Mrs. Henderson can't handle financial responsibility, Mr. Caldwell, I have to ask, exactly what evidence supports that claim?" "Because the evidence I see shows a woman who successfully managed complex financial transactions while her husband was busy hiding money and lying about their true financial position." The courtroom fell silent except for the sound of Tobias's labored breathing. His lawyers had stopped taking notes. There was nothing left to defend. Judge Morrison leaned back in her chair, clearly overwhelmed by the mountain of evidence Wesley had presented. "Mr. Morrison, do you have recommendations for how the court should proceed?" Wesley straightened his tie with casual confidence. "Yes, Your Honor. Given the pattern of financial deception and emotional abuse we've documented, along with Mr. Henderson's attempts to hide marital assets, we recommend the following." He paused, letting the tension build as everyone in the courtroom waited to hear what would happen next. "We recommend that Mrs. Henderson receive 65% of all marital assets, including the hidden accounts, as well as spousal support of $3,000 per month for 10 years. We also recommend that Mr. Henderson be required to pay all of Mrs. Henderson's legal fees and court costs." Tobias made a sound like a wounded animal. Caldwell looked like he was going to be sick. "Furthermore," Wesley continued, "we request a restraining order requiring Mr. Henderson to maintain his distance from Mrs. Henderson and to cease all attempts at contact or intimidation." Judge Morrison nodded slowly. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to need time to review all of this evidence. This case is continued for 2 weeks while I consider your recommendations." As the judge gathered her papers and prepared to leave, Wesley turned back to face Tobias one final time. "You called her nobody, Mr. Henderson," Wesley said quietly. "But you were wrong. She was never nobody. She was the woman who raised a scared little boy to believe in himself. She was the woman who saved your business when you were too proud to admit you were failing. She was the woman who built a beautiful home while you were too busy to notice." Wesley's voice grew stronger. "And now, she's the woman who's going to walk out of here with everything she deserves, while you learn what it really means to have nothing." The courtroom was completely silent as we all absorbed the magnitude of what had just happened. Tobias sat in his chair like a broken man, surrounded by his expensive lawyers who had proven completely useless when faced with the truth. But as I watched Wesley pack up his briefcases and prepare to leave, I realized that this wasn't just about money or revenge. This was about something much more important. It was about a scared 5-year-old boy who had grown up to become the kind of man who would never let anyone call the woman who saved him nobody. And it was about a 63-year-old woman who was finally about to discover what her life could look like when she was free to be somebody. 2 weeks passed like a slow-motion earthquake. Every day brought aftershocks from what had happened in that courtroom, ripples spreading through our small community as word of the proceedings leaked out. Tobias had always been so careful about his reputation, so concerned with appearing successful and respectable. Now that facade was crumbling, one revelation at a time. I spent those weeks staying in a small apartment that Wesley had arranged for me, away from the house on Elm Street where Tobias remained. The space was modest but peaceful, with large windows that let in morning sunlight, and a tiny kitchen where I could make my own coffee without asking anyone's permission. For the first time in decades, I woke up each morning without the knot of anxiety in my stomach that had become so familiar, I thought it was normal. Wesley called me every evening to check on me and to prepare for what he called the final phase of our strategy. During one of these conversations, he mentioned something that made my heart skip a beat. "Aunt Sheila," he said, his voice unusually hesitant, "there's something else we need to discuss. Something I discovered that even I wasn't prepared for." "What is it, Wesley?" There was a long pause before he answered. "It's about Tobias's business, the one you helped save back in 1993. I've been digging deeper into his financial records, and I found something that changes everything." "What do you mean?" "I mean that business, Henderson Construction Services, was never legally his alone. When you invested your grocery store earnings to keep it afloat, you should have been made a partner. Instead, Tobias filed the paperwork to make it a sole proprietorship in his name only, without your knowledge or consent." I sat down heavily in my small kitchen chair, gripping the phone. "I don't understand. What does that mean?" "It means he stole from you, Aunt Sheila, not just emotionally or psychologically. He literally stole your legal share of a business that you saved with your own money, a business that's now worth over $600,000. $600,000. The number felt surreal, like something from someone else's life. "But how can you prove that?" I asked. "Because you kept receipts," Wesley said, and I could hear the smile in his voice. "Remember all those bank deposit slips you saved from your part-time job? The ones you thought were just old paperwork? They prove that you made a direct financial investment in the business during its crucial early period. Combined with witness testimony from people who remember your involvement, we can establish that you were a de facto partner who was illegally excluded from ownership." I thought back to those months of working at the grocery store, coming home exhausted after 8-hour shifts to find Tobias stressed and angry about his failing business. I remembered suggesting ways to save money, helping him reorganize his filing system, even calling potential clients when he was too depressed to make the calls himself. At the time, I thought I was just being a supportive wife. Now I realized I had been an unpaid business partner. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we finish what we started," Wesley said, his voice firm with determination. When we go back to court tomorrow, Tobias is going to discover that calling you nobody was the most expensive mistake of his life. The next morning, I dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that Wesley had insisted on buying for me. "You need to look like the successful businesswoman you always were," he had said, even if no one bothered to acknowledge it before. When I walked into courtroom B, everything felt different. The same oak benches, the same high windows, the same smell of floor wax and old wood. But this time, I wasn't the frightened woman who had been humiliated 2 weeks ago. This time, I walked in with my head held high, flanked by Wesley and his team like a general with her army. Tobias looked terrible. He had lost weight, his expensive suit hung loosely on his frame, and there were dark circles under his eyes. His lawyers surrounded him like bodyguards, but they all had the defeated posture of people who knew they were fighting a losing battle. Judge Morrison entered the courtroom promptly at 9 o'clock, carrying a thick folder of documents. "I've had time to review the evidence presented by both parties," she announced. "This case has revealed some of the most egregious examples of financial deception and emotional abuse that I've seen in 20 years on the bench." She opened her folder and consulted her notes. "Mr. Henderson, the court finds that you have systematically hidden marital assets, emotionally manipulated your wife, and attempted to defraud this proceeding by misrepresenting your true financial position." Tobias sat perfectly still, but I could see his hands trembling. "However," Judge Morrison continued, "Mr. Morrison has presented additional evidence that takes this case into even more serious territory." Wesley stood up with fluid confidence. "Your Honor, thank you. Over the past 2 weeks, our investigation has uncovered evidence of what can only be described as business fraud spanning over 30 years. He nodded to his associates, who began setting up their presentation equipment with the efficiency of a pit crew. "We have discovered that Mr. Henderson has been operating his construction business under false pretenses since 1993, when Mrs. Henderson's direct financial investment saved the company from bankruptcy." The first slide showed copies of my old bank statements, with deposits from the grocery store clearly marked, followed by withdrawals that corresponded exactly to payments made to keep Tobias's business operational. Mrs. Henderson invested $2,400 of her own earnings into Henderson Construction Services at a time when the business had negative cash flow and was 3 months behind on rent. This investment represented 37% of the company's total value at that time. Wesley clicked to the next slide, showing business formation documents that I had never seen before. However, when Mr. Henderson filed for reorganization of the business following this cash infusion, he listed himself as the sole owner and proprietor. Mrs. Henderson's contribution was never acknowledged, and she was never offered the partnership stake that she had earned through her investment. Caldwell stood up weakly. "Objection, Your Honor. Mrs. Henderson made a gift to support her husband's business. That doesn't create a legal partnership." Wesley turned toward Caldwell with the patience of a professor correcting a student's obvious error. "Mr. Caldwell, I would agree with you if this had been a gift, but Mrs. Henderson's own words from that time period tell a different story." The next slide showed a photocopy of a letter I had completely forgotten about, written in my own handwriting 30 years ago. This is a letter that Mrs. Henderson wrote to her sister in October 1993, describing her investment in the business. I quote, "I'm putting my grocery store money into Tobias's company as a business investment. He promised that once things turn around, I'll be made a partner so I can have a say in how things are run. I'm tired of watching him make the same mistakes over and over." I remembered writing that letter, remembered the hope I had felt that finally Tobias would see me as an equal partner instead of just a supportive wife. I also remembered how that promise had been quietly forgotten once the business became profitable again. Furthermore, Wesley continued, "We have testimony from 3 former employees of Henderson Construction Services who remember Mrs. Henderson's active involvement in business operations during the 1990s. She handled client communications, managed the books during busy periods, and even supervised job sites when Mr. Henderson was handling multiple projects. Each piece of evidence was like another nail in Tobias's coffin. I watched him sink deeper into his chair as the true extent of his deception became clear. The current value of Henderson Construction Services is approximately $600,000, Wesley announced. Based on Mrs. Henderson's original investment and continued involvement, she is entitled to 37% ownership of this business. 37% of $600,000, $222,000 that I had never known belonged to me. But Wesley wasn't finished. Your Honor, there's one more matter that needs to be addressed. During our investigation, we discovered that Mr. Henderson has been using business funds for personal expenses, including payments to a private investigator hired to monitor Mrs. Henderson's activities during their separation. I felt a chill run down my spine. Tobias had been having me watched. These surveillance reports, which Mr. Henderson paid for with money that legally belonged to both spouses, reveal that Mrs. Henderson's activities during their separation consisted entirely of visiting the library, grocery shopping, and attending church services. In other words, Mr. Henderson spent marital funds to confirm that his wife was exactly as honest and trustworthy as she appeared to be. The irony was devastating. Tobias had been so convinced that I was hiding something, so certain that I must be as deceptive as he was, that he had paid thousands of dollars to prove his own paranoia wrong. The total amount spent on surveillance was $8,700, Wesley continued. Money that came directly from the business account that Mrs. Henderson had unknowingly co-owned for 30 years. Judge Morrison leaned forward, her expression stern. Mr. Henderson, do you have anything to say in your defense? For a moment, I thought Tobias might remain silent. Then he stood up slowly, ignoring Caldwell's attempts to keep him seated. Your Honor, he said, his voice hoarse and broken, I never meant for things to go this far. I thought she would be grateful for what I provided. I thought she understood that I was the one making the important decisions. He turned to look at me for the first time since Wesley's presentation began. Sheila, you have to understand. I was protecting you. You were never cut out for business. You were never strong enough to handle real responsibility. The old me might have believed him. The old me might have accepted that his manipulation and control had been for my own good. But the woman sitting in that courtroom had spent 2 weeks remembering who she used to be before she learned to make herself smaller and quieter to fit into Tobias's world. Your Honor, I said, standing up with a confidence that surprised even me. I'd like to respond to that. Judge Morrison nodded. Go ahead, Mrs. Henderson. I looked directly at Tobias, seeing him clearly for perhaps the first time in decades. Tobias, you're right about one thing. I was never cut out for the kind of business you do, the kind that involves lying to your partner, hiding money, and treating the people who love you like they're disposable. My voice grew stronger with each word, but I was always strong enough to handle responsibility. I handled the responsibility of keeping our family together while you focused on yourself. I handled the responsibility of supporting your dreams while setting aside my own. And I handled the responsibility of investing in a young man's future without expecting anything in return, except the satisfaction of knowing I had done the right thing. I gestured toward Wesley, who was watching me with pride in his eyes. That investment taught me something about what real strength looks like. Real strength isn't about controlling other people or making them feel small so you can feel big. Real strength is about lifting others up and trusting that they'll remember your kindness when it matters most. I sat back down, my heart pounding but my mind clear. Tobias stared at me like he was seeing a stranger, which in many ways, he was. Judge Morrison consulted her notes one final time before speaking. Based on the evidence presented, this court finds that Mr. Henderson has engaged in a pattern of financial deception, emotional abuse, and business fraud spanning multiple decades. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the courtroom. Mrs. Henderson is awarded 65% of all acknowledged marital assets, plus 37% ownership of Henderson Construction Services. Additionally, Mr. Henderson will pay spousal support of $4,000 per month for 12 years, as well as all legal fees and court costs associated with this proceeding. $4,000 a month for 12 years, nearly $600,000 in total, plus my share of the business and the other assets. The numbers were staggering. Furthermore, Judge Morrison continued, a restraining order is hereby issued requiring Mr. Henderson to maintain a distance of at least 500 feet from Mrs. Henderson at all times. Tobias collapsed back into his chair as if he had been physically struck. His lawyers were frantically whispering among themselves, probably calculating how much money their client had just lost and how it would affect their own fees. But I wasn't thinking about the money, stunning as it was. I was thinking about the letter Wesley had shown the court, the one where I had written about wanting to be a partner, wanting to have a say in decisions. For 30 years, I had accepted being treated as a silent supporter. Now, finally, my voice had been heard. As Judge Morrison dismissed the court and people began filing out, Wesley approached me with a smile that lit up his entire face. "How do you feel, Aunt Sheila?" he asked. I thought about the question seriously before answering. How did I feel? Vindicated, certainly. Relieved, absolutely. But more than anything, I felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. I felt free. I feel, I said slowly, like I'm finally ready to find out who I really am when nobody's trying to convince me I'm nobody. Wesley laughed and offered me his arm. Well then, let's go discover that together. As we walked out of the courtroom together, I could hear Tobias behind us, arguing desperately with his lawyers about appeals and legal technicalities. But his voice sounded very far away, like an echo from a life I had already left behind. The courthouse steps were bright with afternoon sunlight, and for the first time in 41 years, I walked down them as my own woman. 6 months later, I stood in the kitchen of my new home, a charming cottage with a wraparound porch and a garden that I was slowly bringing back to life. The morning sun streamed through windows that I had chosen myself, illuminating walls painted in soft yellow because it was my favorite color, and I no longer needed anyone's permission to surround myself with things that made me happy. The cottage was smaller than the house on Elm Street, but it was entirely mine. Every piece of furniture, every picture on the wall, every plant in the garden had been chosen because it brought me joy, not because it fit someone else's idea of what my life should look like. The kitchen was my favorite room, with open shelves displaying the colorful dishes I had collected over the past few months, and a small breakfast nook where I could sit with my morning coffee and watch the birds in my backyard. This morning was special. Wesley was coming for Sunday breakfast, a tradition we had started after the divorce was finalized. He usually arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, carrying fresh flowers from the farmer's market and whatever newspaper he thought would interest me most. These weekly visits had become the highlight of my week, a chance to connect with the man who had become the son I never had. I was just taking a tray of blueberry muffins out of the oven when I heard his car in the driveway. Through the window, I could see him walking up the garden path, and my heart swelled with the same fierce pride I had felt watching him in that courtroom 6 months ago. He looked successful and confident in his casual weekend clothes, but when he smiled at me through the kitchen window, I could still see traces of the thoughtful little boy who used to practice his letters at my table. "Morning, Aunt Sheila," he said as he came through the back door, carrying a bouquet of sunflowers and a warm paper bag from the bakery downtown. "What's this?" I asked, accepting the flowers with a smile. "Croissants from that French place you mentioned wanting to try. I figured we could be adventurous this morning." I laughed, appreciating how he always remembered the small things I mentioned in passing. Adventurous is a good word for how I feel these days. As we settled at the breakfast table with our coffee and food, Wesley pulled out a manila envelope that he had been carrying under his arm. "I have some news," he said, his expression serious but with an underlying excitement that I had learned to recognize. "It's about Tobias." My stomach tightened reflexively. Even though the restraining order meant I never had to see him, Tobias still existed somewhere in the background of my thoughts, like a storm cloud that might return without warning. "What kind of news?" I asked carefully. Wesley opened the envelope and pulled out a legal document. "He's filed for bankruptcy, personal and business. Everything is gone." I stared at the papers, trying to process what this meant. Everything. The house, the business, all of it. Apparently, he made some very poor financial decisions after the divorce. Without your careful management and the hidden money he had been relying on, he couldn't maintain his lifestyle or keep the business profitable. Wesley's expression was neutral, but I could see something like satisfaction in his eyes. He also tried to declare the spousal support payments as unaffordable, but the judge denied his request. The divorce settlement stands as agreed. I took a sip of my coffee, surprised by my own reaction. I had expected to feel victorious or vindicated, but instead I felt something closer to pity. Tobias had spent so much energy trying to control and diminish me that he had forgotten to build anything real for himself. "What happens to him now?" I asked. Wesley shrugged. "That's not our concern anymore. The lawyers handling his bankruptcy will sort out whatever assets remain. But I thought you should know that you'll never have to worry about him trying to come back or demanding changes to the settlement." The relief that washed over me was profound. For months, I had been waiting for the other shoe to drop, for Tobias to find some new way to disrupt the peace I had built. Now, finally, that chapter was truly closed. "There's something else," Wesley said, his tone shifting to something warmer. "I wanted to talk to you about the scholarship fund." I raised an eyebrow. "What scholarship fund?" Wesley smiled. "The one we're going to start with some of your settlement money, if you're interested." He pulled out another set of papers, these ones covered with his neat handwriting and detailed financial projections. "I've been thinking about everything you did for me, and everything my mom went through trying to give me opportunities that didn't exist in our world. There are other kids out there right now, kids like I was, who have the potential to do great things but no way to access the education they need." I leaned forward, intrigued by the passion in his voice. "I want to create a scholarship program for children of domestic workers, immigrants, and single mothers. Full scholarships, not just tuition, but living expenses, books, everything they need to succeed. And I want to name it after my mom." Wesley's eyes glistened with unshed tears. "The Carmen Morales Scholarship Fund. What do you think?" I felt my own eyes fill with emotion. Carmen would have loved knowing that her sacrifice was being honored in a way that would help other families like hers. "How much would it cost to start something like that?" I asked. "To really make a difference? To fully fund 5 students per year through 4-year degrees? About $100,000 initially, then $50,000 per year after that to maintain it." $100,000. 6 months ago, that would have seemed like an impossible amount. Now, with the settlement and my share of the business, it was entirely within my means. "Yes," I said immediately. "Absolutely yes." Wesley's face lit up with joy. "Really? You're sure?" I thought about Carmen, about the dignity with which she had faced every challenge, about the love she had poured into raising Wesley despite having so little material support. I thought about the woman I had become since walking out of that courthouse, the confidence I had discovered in myself when I stopped apologizing for taking up space in the world. "Carmen believed in investing in people's potential," I said. "She invested her love and hopes in you, and look how that turned out. I invested in your education, and you used it to save my life. Now we get to invest in other young people who deserve the same chance." Wesley reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "You know what this means, don't you?" I tilted my head, curious. "It means you're going to be busy. Scholarship committees, interviews with applicants, mentoring students once they're in college. You're going to have a whole new career." The word career sent a thrill through me. At 63 years old, I was going to have my first real career. doing work that mattered in ways I could measure and celebrate. "I think I'd like that," I said, smiling at the thought of all the young people we could help, all the dreams we could make possible. After Wesley left that afternoon, I spent the evening in my garden, pulling weeds and planting the fall flowers I had bought at the nursery. The physical work felt good, therapeutic in a way that reminded me of all those years of improving the house on Elm Street. But this time, every improvement I made would benefit me directly. As the sun began to set, I sat on my front porch with a glass of wine, watching the neighborhood children ride their bicycles on the quiet street. A young couple walked by with their toddler, the woman pushing a stroller while the man carried a diaper bag, and pointed out different flowers in the yards they passed. They looked happy, comfortable with each other in a way that spoke of genuine partnership. I thought about the marriage I had just left behind, about the woman I had been for 41 years. She wasn't a bad woman. She had been loving, supportive, generous to a fault. But she had also been afraid, always walking on eggshells, always making herself smaller to accommodate someone else's ego. The woman sitting on this porch was different. She still had all the good qualities of the old Sheila, but she also had something new, the unshakable knowledge of her own worth. She had learned that kindness didn't require self-sacrifice, that love shouldn't come with conditions, and that helping others was most powerful when it came from a place of strength rather than obligation. My phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Wesley. "Talked to a lawyer about setting up the scholarship fund. Can we meet this week to go over the details? Also, I think we should plan a small ceremony to announce it. Carmen deserves to be celebrated properly." I typed back, "Yes to everything. I'm proud of the man you've become, and I know your mother would be too." His response came immediately. "I'm proud of the woman you've become too. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to become who you were meant to be." I set my phone aside and looked out at my garden, where the flowers Carmen had taught me to grow were blooming in colors she would have loved. The roses she had helped me plant at the old house were probably still blooming too, but they belonged to someone else's story now. These flowers were mine, grown in soil I had chosen, tended with hands that belonged completely to myself for the first time in decades. They were beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with anyone else's expectations, and everything to do with the simple joy of creating something lovely for its own sake. As darkness fell and the streetlights flickered on, I realized something that would have surprised the woman I used to be. I wasn't lonely. Despite having spent most of my adult life defining myself in relation to other people, as Tobias's wife, as a mother, as Carmen's friend, I had discovered that I genuinely enjoyed my own company. I liked the woman I was when no one was watching, when no one needed anything from me, when I could simply exist without explanation or apology. I liked her strength, her kindness, her quiet determination to build something meaningful from the wreckage of what came before. The night air was cool and peaceful, filled with the sound of crickets and the distant laughter of neighbors enjoying their own evening routines. I pulled a soft shawl around my shoulders and settled deeper into my porch chair, in no hurry to go inside. Tomorrow would bring new plans to make, scholarship applications to review, young lives to impact in positive ways. There would be board meetings and interviews, strategy sessions and celebration dinners. There would be all the busy, purposeful work of a woman who had finally found her calling. But tonight, there was just this. The simple pleasure of sitting in peace on my own front porch, surrounded by the garden I had planted, and the life I had built from nothing but determination and the love of people who had never called me nobody. I raised my wine glass in a silent toast to Carmen, wherever she was, thanking her for raising the kind of son who would remember the woman who believed in him when it mattered most. Then I toasted the sunset, the flowers, and the quiet miracle of a life that had somehow turned out better than I ever dared to dream. At 63 years old, I was finally exactly where I belonged, in a story where I was the heroine, not the supporting character. And the best part was, this was just the beginning. The price of loyalty, I had learned, could be devastatingly high when it was given to the wrong person. But the price of freedom, The cost of choosing yourself after decades of choosing everyone else was worth everything I had paid to earn it. Some endings are really beginnings in disguise. Some losses turn out to be the most valuable gifts you never knew you needed. And sometimes, the people who try to make you feel like nobody end up teaching you exactly how to be somebody worth knowing. I finished my wine as the last light faded from the sky, then went inside to plan tomorrow's adventures. There were so many possibilities ahead, and for the first time in my life, they all belonged to me. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.